Good evening, everyone, and welcome to Affinity's first webinar of 2022 in collaboration with the Institute for Economics and Peace, IEP. It is indeed a pleasure to collaborate once more with Affinity and to join a distinguished panel of speakers this evening. I'd like to begin by respectfully acknowledging the traditional custodians on the land in which I'm meeting with you, the Cammeraygal people of the Eora Nation, and to pay my respects to their elders past, present and emerging, and to all descendants who have cared for this place since creation. We also honour all other Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples who are joining us today. My name is Patricia Garcia. I'm the Partnerships Development Manager at the Institute for Economics and Peace. Institute for Economics and Peace, IEP, is an independent, non-partisan, not-for-profit global think tank dedicated to developing metrics to analyse peace and quantifying the economic value of peace. Founded in 2008, our founder, Steve Kilalea, with the Institute for Economics and Peace, aims to use data-driven research to show that peace is a positive, tangible, and achievable measure of human well-being and development. Some of our best-known publications are the Global Peace Index, the GPI, which measures the absence of violence or the fear of violence in 163 countries, which represents approximately 99.7% of the world's total population, and it's now on its 15th edition. Other publications are the Global Terrorism Index, the Positive Peace Report, the Economic Value of Peace, and the inaugural Ecological Threat Register. It is my great privilege here to welcome all of you to the launch of the 2022 Global Terrorism Index. The Global Terrorism Index, GTI, is an annual report produced by IEP. Now on its 9th edition, the GTI provides a comprehensive summary of the key global trends and patterns in terrorism. It analyses a number of vital aspects of terrorism, such as the socio-economic conditions under which it occurs, how terrorism is over time, the geopolitical drivers and ideological aims of terrorist groups, and the strategies used by terrorists. The report covers a 50-year span and places an emphasis on trends over the last decade. Without further ado, I would like to introduce tonight's facilitator, Associate Professor Julian Droogan. Dr. Droogan heads the Terrorism Research Program at the Department of Security Studies and Criminology at Macquarie University, and is a very valuable member of the Affinity Advisory Board. Welcome, Julian.
Thank you very much, Patricia. Thank you for that very warm welcome. It's an absolute pleasure to be here, as always, to support Affinity in its first webinar for the year, but also, I think, to support and to help publicise the brilliant work that you will do at the Institute for Economics and Peace. And tonight, as you mentioned, we will be looking at the latest Terrorism Index. This is an invaluable resource that has been produced now for 9 years by the Institute for Economics and Peace. I can tell you from my own personal experience that it is poured over. It's data-driven research and long-term analysis is poured over and considered invaluable by academics, but also by media, policymakers and members of the general public right around the world. And we could not have a better person from the Institute for Economics and Peace here with us tonight to talk a little bit about the trends that you've seen over 2021 into 2022, and to walk us through some of the data, some of the statistics, some of which might be more surprising, some less so. Tonight we have Briahna Tandoh with us. Briahna is a research fellow at the Institute for Economics and Peace. Briahna holds a Bachelor's of Arts in Socio-Legal Studies and also History, as well as a Master's of Criminology from the University of Sydney. Briahna was previously a Senior Intelligence Analyst for the New South Wales Police Force, providing intelligence support for strategic, operational and also tactical decision-making at a local, regional and also at the state level within the New South Wales Police. Her research interests include global security issues, global security studies, as well as counter-terrorism and social and political issues from a criminological lens. Briahna, it's an absolute pleasure to have you with us tonight. In a moment, we will begin your presentation. I'd just like to remind all of you watching, we do want to create a discussion around the latest Global Terrorism Index. So we would really like you to be putting your questions into the chat box. Do not be shy. There are no silly questions. We're happy to look at and discuss all questions related to terrorism. At the moment, it is a vexed issue, so put your questions in the chat box and we'll get to those questions throughout the presentation. We may pause partway through the presentation to do some Q&A and have some discussion and then come back again to more Q&A at the end of the presentation. So without further ado, again, welcome Briahna. It's lovely to have you here and we're very much looking forward to your presentation this evening.
Thank you, Julian. So welcome everyone to the 2022 GTI launch with Affinity. Thank you for having IEP yet again. It's great to be here. So just a little bit of an introduction about the Institute for Economics and Peace. So the Institute for Economics and Peace was set up to understand the intersection of business, peace and economics. I'll just get you to go to the next slide, please. Thank you. So as Patricia said at the beginning, we're an independent non-for-profit think tank dedicated to building a greater understanding of the key drivers of peace and identifying the economic benefits that increased peacefulness can deliver. So we were founded in 2007 by Steve Killalay, and we have international offices. We're obviously based here in Sydney, Australia. We also have offices in New York, Brussels, The Hague and Mexico City, as well as Harare in Zimbabwe. So next slide, please. So the Institute for Economics and Peace, our research is used extensively by organisations including the OECD, Commonwealth Secretariat, World Bank and the United Nations. Our work is also included in thousands of university courses and we accrue about 350,000 downloads of our reports each year. Next slide, please. These are some of the products, as Patricia mentioned at the beginning. So we have the Global Peace Index that arrives in about June every year. We also have some programs such as the Ambassadors Program and our Peace Academy, as well as obviously the GTI, which is what we're all here for tonight. Next slide. So I'll give a bit of an introduction about what the Global Terrorism Index is. Next. So it's actually in our 9th edition this year, but it does rank 163 countries, which is about 99% of the world's population, according to the relative impact of terrorism. The GTI was originally an indicator for the Global Peace Index. It was then made into its own report, developed by obviously IEP. We also include contributions from international experts. Next, please. As to our methodology, the Global Terrorism Index defines terrorism according to the terrorism tracker, which is developed by a company called Dragonfly. And that definition is the systematic threat or use of violence, whether for or in opposition to established authority, with the intention of communicating a political, religious, or ideological message to a group larger than the victim group by generating fear and altering the behaviour of the larger group. In terms of methodology, we use terrorism tracker data with incidences, injuries, deaths, and hostages weighted accordingly over 5 years to measure the long-term impact of terrorism in accordance with socio-economic indicators. Those scores are also then banded, and that's how we come up with our Global Terrorism Index scores. Next slide, please. Next, thank you. So this map here shows for 2021, for the 2022 index, the scores across the world. So the green equals a lower impact of terrorism, and the dark red is a higher impact of terrorism. You can see in 2021, the hotspots of terrorism are the Sahel in Sub-Saharan Africa, the Middle East, and South Asia as well. Next, please. Next again. So the highlights for this year's report. So what we found in this report was that deaths from terrorism were down 1.2% to 7,142 deaths. So this trend has continued over the last 4 years. The number of attacks have also were up in the last year by 17% to just over 5,000 attacks, meaning that terrorism has become less lethal over the last year, with a decline in the sophistication and effectiveness of attacks at causing death. We also found 119 countries had no deaths at all from terrorism. So in terms of the scores, 86 countries improved compared to 19 that deteriorated, with terrorism becoming more concentrated in conflict zones. So 97% of terrorism we found occurred in conflict zones, with attacks in these conflict zones 6 times deadlier than anywhere else in the world. We also found that the Sahel was now the new epicenter of terrorism, with deaths in that region up 10 times since 2007. Next, please. We also found that deaths decreased in Sub-Saharan Africa by 10%. This is largely due to the success of counter-terrorism measures against Boko Haram. Deaths in the Middle East and North Africa, which we call MENA, continue to decline as well. They're down 14% to just over 1,000. Islamic State and affiliates were the most deadly terror group in 2021, with deaths sitting at around 2,000 deaths in 20 countries. JNIM is the fastest growing terror group with 352 deaths, an increase of 69% in 1 year. We also found that Islamic State of West Africa as an affiliate on its own was the most lethal terror group, with 23 attacks with 15 deaths on average per attack. Next, please. So attacks in the West have fallen substantially over the last 4 years, with 59 attacks in 2021, resulting in 10 deaths, down about 70%. We also found that politically motivated terrorism overtakes religious terrorism in the West, with politically motivated terrorist attacks are 5 times higher in the last 5 years than religious terrorism. Myanmar has the largest increase in terrorism, rising 20 times in 1 year to 521 deaths as a result of a coup. Mozambique recorded the largest drop with 90 deaths, down at around 80%. Next, please. So this here is the countries most impacted by terrorism, the top 10. Afghanistan recorded the highest impact for terrorism for the 3rd consecutive year this year. So that was followed by Iraq, Somalia, Burkina Faso, Syria, Nigeria, Mali, Niger, and Myanmar, and then Pakistan to follow. Next, please. So these are the top 10 countries here with how much of their deaths contributed to the world's death toll this year. So as you can see, 4 of those top 10 countries are actually in the Sahel, with Myanmar being the only new country. You can see in the top 10 here in this graph that they accounted for 85% of all deaths from terrorism in 2021. So that's just following on from the narrative that I already mentioned, where terrorism is becoming more concentrated. Additionally, all of these countries are in conflict, in some sort of conflict. You can see Afghanistan on its own accounted for 20% of the world's deaths, with the rest of the world only accounting for 14%. So that's following on with that concentration. Next slide, please. So this graph really drives home the point that terrorism is becoming more concentrated. These are the 5 most impacted countries where deaths have increased by 21%. Deaths fell around 19% for all other countries. Again, terrorism is being more concentrated in these conflict areas. The Sahel countries on this graph, so you've got Niger, Mali, and Burkina Faso, they're 3 of the top worst 5 countries for the year, and they're all in the Sahel. Next, please. Next, please. So the deteriorations, as you can see, and as I mentioned, Myanmar had the largest increase in deaths from terrorism between 2020 and 2021. So if we look to the shifting landscape, we can see obviously Myanmar had that large increase. It's largely due to the coup in 2021. We know that terrorism thrives on insecurity and uncertainty, and thus the coup provided the perfect place for terrorism to thrive. Next, please. Next, please. So the trends in terrorism. So this graph here shows the change in where deaths were located between 2007 and 2021. So you can see that deaths from terrorism have actually decreased by a third since the peak of 2015. That yellow block in the center is Iraq. So you can see there that Iraq had quite a significant peak in 2016, which has then declined. You can also see that the Sahel has taken over that place with a large majority of the deaths this year located in the Sahel, where all other countries has not changed much since 2007. So if we removed all the conflict zones, we would still be left with an underlying threat of terrorism throughout the world. Next, please. So this graph shows the deadliest terror groups between 2007 and 2021 in a similar way to the previous one. Islamic State was the deadliest known terrorist group for the 4th consecutive year. So what you can see there is that the major terrorist groups have contributed to trends in death and how they've changed over time. The decline of the Taliban is quite visible. You can see that there was a more of a contribution in the latter half of last decade that's kind of filtered out in favor of Islamic State and a couple of the other groups that are present in Sub-Saharan Africa as well. Next, please. Next, please. Next, please. So this one here shows the trends again by region. So what you can see there is that Sub-Saharan Africa has overtaken the Middle East and South Asia as well as the region with the most terrorism. Next, please. Yep, next. Okay, so this one here shows that in particular to IS related terrorism. So you can see that Islamic State with the various branches and affiliates of Islamic State, Islamic State West Africa has taken over general Islamic State as contributing more deaths to the terrorism landscape. Next, please. Next, please. So that just drives home here as well, where MENA has been overtaken by Sub-Saharan Africa as the region contributing to most deaths by Islamic State, showing again that the Sahel is the most concentrated for terrorism. Next, please. So I might stop now and we might begin the Q&A. Julian?
Absolutely, Briahna. And thank you so much for that first part of the presentation. You know, it's always fascinating, to see these trends. And I think one of the real contributions that the IUP makes is to be able to present these trends, over a good period of time as well, so we get a better sense, of what's happening over time. I think one of the dangers of terrorism studies and terrorism pundits can be that they focus a little bit on the short term, the latest issues, rather than looking at the bigger pictures over time. And one thing I noticed looking at your slides was this slight increase in the number of attacks, but a decrease in their lethality and how deadly they are. And you mentioned that was really to do with a shifting strategy or maybe a shifting tactic of using, low technology weapons perhaps, or attacks, rather than the more elaborate, explosive derived, attacks, maybe using a knife or something like that. I mean, is that what we're talking about here? Are we talking about something that's really just an opportunity that people are taking to use more simple, weapons in their attacks? Or is something else going on here? Is it something to do with the parts of the world that terrorism is becoming more predominant in, or something like that?
It's a little bit of both, I would say. So if you look particularly to the West, you've got, which I will speak a bit about later, the West actually had more political terrorism, as I mentioned earlier as well. With these tactics, you've got quite a lot of disruptive tactics. So you've got terrorism where you're setting fire to things. So like a lot of far left and far right terrorism, or political terrorism as a whole, will be setting fire to government buildings and sort of getting their point across in that way, rather than hurting people. You've also got a lot of terrorism being disrupted as well. So that could be towards the counter-terrorism frame. So that growing sophistication of counter-terrorism versus the lesser sophistication of insurgency groups. We also saw a lot of factionalization with terrorist groups. So Islamic State, West Africa Boko Haram lost their leader. Islamic State also lost their leaders. So you've got that sort of factionalization. So all of these things could play a part in that decrease in deaths. You've also got COVID as well that could play a part into it. But there's many things, like we're quite a data-driven organization, so we pretty much just link the data together, but we do also have some sort of explanations, I guess.
Yeah, absolutely. And one thing you've brought up again there too, I think, is that shifting globally in the terrorism landscape with this concentration, if you like, of terrorist incidents in Sub-Saharan Africa and the Sahara region, but also, in South Asia and to a lesser degree the Middle East as well. And this connection, I think, more stark than ever between terrorism and conflict zones, war zones or areas of conflict, state repression, and so on. And I'm just wondering whether this is really another way of saying that international terrorism that we became very familiar with after 9/11 is to some degree waning and not nearly as prevalent as it was. And when I say international terrorism, I'm talking like about a group like Al-Qaeda or Islamic State plotting an attack in one country, maybe one in the Middle East, and then carrying out that attack somewhere else, like in Australia or in Sri Lanka or something like that. And these international attacks, as we know from airline hijackings and the 9/11 attacks and bus bombings and so on, they tend to have far greater casualties. So I'm just wondering whether the data that you're looking at suggests that international terrorism is not really on the ascendancy at the moment. Terrorism is something that is really distilling or concentrating back into these conflict zones where, maybe local factions are using terrorist tactics, or they might be affiliating with international brands like ISIS or something like that.
Mm-hmm. Well, I mean, again, it depends exactly where we're talking about. But what we do know is that terrorism thrives on insecurity and uncertainty. So we do have a lot of conflict zones. We had, I think, about 4 or 5 coups in Sub-Saharan Africa in the last year. We've also had, Myanmar's coup. We've had the conflict in Ukraine as well. These are all big breeding grounds for terrorism. So in terms of what we found, of course, we found that 97% of terrorism was in some area with the conflict. So I guess in that way, yes, that is the point of the concentration. In terms of international terrorism, it is often difficult to sort of figure out where these people are coming from, because you've got, some people that are traveling for terrorism, with travel being limited at the moment or was limited during COVID. That could be a hamper to it, but it all remains to be seen what will happen after all of these travel restrictions are lifted, and whether that rises again or whether it doesn't, remains to be seen.
Sure. Yeah, I imagine COVID has certainly had a dampening effect to some degree on the reach of international groups, including terror groups, certainly. But you mentioned also, again, the Sahara region, that sort of area below the Sahara Desert in kind of Central Africa, as being a really a hotspot at the moment, a crisis zone when it comes to terrorism. But if we just look at it through the prism of terrorism, we might be misreading the situation. You just mentioned these coups. You've I think, alluded to political instability. We've seen civil wars and so on in places like Sudan in recent years. We've also seen conflict in places like West Sahara and so on. Are we really, if we're focusing on terrorism, missing the bigger picture? I mean, what's going on in Sub-Saharan Africa that's creating the opportunities for these ISIS-affiliated groups and others to be making so many attacks and doing what they're doing?
So, like you said, you've got political insecurity that plays a big part. You've also got you've got food insecurity, you've got water insecurity in those regions as well. Some of those countries in the Sahel as well experience a large population growth, like our ecological threat register report that came out last year found that Niger was anticipated to have 161% growth in population in the next 30 years. So all of that instability combined provides the perfect breeding ground for terrorists. And also that region is quite desolate as well. So the conflict zones that we found with terrorism, the concentration of terrorism was largely towards those like border regions. So like the tri-border region with Niger and Chad, I believe, had a high concentration of terrorism. So it's quite difficult for governments to go out and push troops out that sort of way when there's not a lot of food, water, and a lot of people around. So it does make it quite difficult, those regions.
Yeah, these are definitely regions where the arm of the state sits quite lightly, over local populations, and areas. But again, I think I'd just say that one of the things that's really useful with the IEP reports is this ability to look at the larger systemic drivers of terrorism. And you've mentioned the environment, and you've mentioned, regime stability. I really think the environment is a big issue there. And I think one of the things that is really useful about the IEP and the things that you produce, the reports that you produce, is to be able to check that against, say, the ecological threat register, or the peace index that you produce as well, and to see where there's overlapping. Do you ever do that in your office? Do you ever sort of get out of this data-driven, siloed approach to a particular topic and sort of bring the ecological register together with the terrorism index and together with the peace index and get a sort of holistic big picture perspective? Or do you stay very focused on the question at hand and what the data is telling you?
Well, I mean, the good thing is we try to bring in as many of our products and the convergence of each of these products in as we can. So you'll find a lot of our products will mention our positive peace concept. The Global Peace Index as well includes the Global Terrorism Index indicator as an indicator as well. We also include some information about the environment in the Global Peace Index, because it's just all linked, that you can't separate any of these things from the drivers of peace, really.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's something that we certainly try to instill in our research and our teaching, in our security studies programs, that holistic linked nature of these conflicts and these security issues. Everything from, drought in Syria being one of the causes to the, Syrian war, which leads to things like, the rise of ISIS and so many other, knock-on effects. Getting a bit closer to home, though, and looking at Australia or the West more broadly, you talked in the index about this sort of shift from religious terrorism to political terrorism. Now, as a researcher, I would say that the term religious terrorism is usually a euphemism for Islamic terrorism, and political terrorism is usually a euphemism for far-right extremism or terrorist actions. But you also mentioned the far left and potentially groups or movements like Antifa as well. Is that what we're looking at here in the West? Are we looking at a sort of a decline of international ISIS or Al-Qaeda inspired incidents, and instead this sort of moving into sort of the more violent extremism space with political polarization and restiveness and so on in the United States and Europe and Australia, sort of feeding into these violent incidents and hate crimes and violent attacks and so on, which are being sort of caught up in this terrorism register?
So in regards to, say, political terrorism, I think the far left and far right sort of disparity that we're used to historically is actually maybe a little bit outdated. So political terrorism, I know that ASIO and a couple of other security organizations have strived to not use far left and far right anymore, more so political, because there's a lot of convergence between the two sort of sides now. The index found that 17% of attacks on both the far left and far right groups were on government institutions and political figures. So there is some convergence and similarities between the two groups. Like you said, yes, religious terrorism in the West, we do sort of associate with those inspired, like Islamic terrorism inspired attacks. But yeah, in terms of the political terrorism overtaking the religious terrorism, there's a lot of factors that could be accountable for that. So, a lot of, say, in the UK with Brexit, there's a lot of disillusionment with the government. COVID levels a lot of distrust. So again, terrorism plays into that insecurity and instability within people and populations, and then attacks are born, really, and terrorists are made. You also had, again, to go back to COVID, you had the online, everyone's online, no one's interacting and having their own views challenged by other people. So that could also play a role in specifically political terrorism. But yeah, extremism as a whole in the West is the attacks are declining, but you only have to see from the Australian counter-terrorism policy that came out a couple of weeks ago that they are actually worried about terrorism rising again in Australia in particular. So they're worried about, with the COVID restrictions being removed, that more gatherings will attract more terrorism. So whether that's from a political aspect or a religious aspect, we will find out, I guess, or hopefully not.
Yeah, well, we certainly are seeing, I think, in Australia and other Western countries, this mix and match approach to extremism, where many of the individuals and even groups, may oscillate between those, as you say, quite old-fashioned, outdated views of left politics, right politics, into something that is more anti-government, really, and anti-status quo, or even maybe more conspiratorial in some cases. When you look at conspiratorial movements like QAnon or whatever, feeding into violence potentially in places. It certainly brings up interesting questions about terrorism when you can't identify an ideology behind it. Is it still terrorism? But that's maybe a discussion for another day. Briahna, it might be a good opportunity now to sort of transition to the second part of the presentation. And we're getting some good questions coming through from the audience, but I just want to remind people that now's the time to type your questions into the chat. The more we have, the more we can discuss in the second part of this evening's talk, a fascinating talk. And Briahna, I can't wait to hear the rest.
Thank you, Julian. Okay, so with the Sahel, so as you can see there, that these graphs show the change over time in incidences and deaths. So you can see that 2015 spike in both deaths and incidences, that's probably due to Boko Haram and their resurgence. You can also see that incidences and deaths in the Sahel have significantly increased just over the 2017 to 2021 period. It's in fact been increasing every year since 2016. That little drop there in 2020, it's a little bit difficult to say there. It's most likely due to the result of effective counter-terrorism, counterinsurgency operations, particularly by the French. They saw some success in that terrorism fled across the region, but within a year or two they reorganized. So an example of that is JNIM, which emerged in 2017, and thus terrorism resumed in that region. Next, please. So this graph here shows the kidnappings in the Sahel, where they have increased exponentially since 2010. So as we know, terrorists fund themselves through illicit activity, and one of these big tactics is kidnapping. It's just one way to raise funds for these terrorist organizations, with bargaining for whatever they need from the governments in exchange for hostages. Next, please. So this here is what I was mentioning with the Sahel coinciding with ecological threats. So this graph here shows the ETR score from our Ecological Threat Register report that was released last year. So, like I said, the level of terrorism is strongly associated with food and water scarcity. So you can see there, the higher the terrorism, the more insecurity there is in terms of the environment. So the Sahel itself has some of the worst ecological degradation in the world. So our ETR stated that most of the countries in the lower end of the report were in conflict. So you then have that vicious cycle of terrorism, ecological threat, and water, food scarcity, as well as conflict again. So, for example, Niger had is anticipated to have a growth of 161% in population in the next 30 years. So these environmental threats need to be addressed in order to improve the situation in the Sahel region. Next slide, please. I will go next. So we'll jump into what we were discussing before with terrorism in the West. Next slide, please. So this graph here shows the fatalities in the West. So we can see that historically that deaths have occurred more from religious terrorism than any other terrorism in the West. Notable religious attacks include Paris, also the concert bombings in the UK. Next, please. So when we have a look at the more recent attacks, we can see that there's been a decrease in the last 3 years in terms of terrorism in the West. Political terrorism has now overtaken religious terrorism as the most common motivator. So it's spread across various ideologies. Like we said, ideologies, so far left and far right, have converged and groups have become less organised than they were previously. So that decrease could be attributed to better intelligence agencies and their ability to pick up threats before they were executed. Could also be attributed to anything from COVID or anything like that as well. Next slide, please. So again, the political terrorism has overtaken religious terrorism. Political attacks in the West are 5 times higher at the moment than religious attacks. We only had 3 Islamist attacks in Europe in 2021, which resulted in 2 deaths. There were only 7 attacks in the US, and none were actually tied to an organised group. And as I stated before, there are similarities now between far left and far right terrorists. So both target governments in 17% of attacks. So similar motivations behind these attacks as well: alienation from the system, disenfranchisement from other groups as well, and that anti-government sentiment feeds through both far left and far right terrorist groups. Next, please. So now to something a bit more contemporary, as I guess a case study for our findings in relation to the intersection between conflict and terrorism with the conflict in Ukraine. We'll go next slide, please. Thank you. So just before we put out the GTI, we actually put out a small report on Ukraine and the context within which the conflict exists. So you can find that on our website, as well as the Global Terrorism Index. So for context, the report found that 80% of all terrorist attacks occur within 50 kilometres of an ongoing conflict, with 97% of all terrorism deaths occurring in a conflict zone. So that then again drives home the link between terrorism and conflict. Next, please. So in particular to terrorism in Ukraine, this can be seen in the case of Georgia and also the war in Georgia, and also the annexation of Crimea, where Georgia and Ukraine experienced major spikes in terrorism during 2008 and 2014. Ukraine suffered 78 attacks and Georgia 41 at their peak. The number of attacks we would expect to increase, especially in terror-like activity. However that manifests remains to be seen. But as the intensity of conflict increases, so does the intensity of terrorism. So in the lead up to this conflict, we found that cyber attacks were increasing. So we had about 400,000 in 2020, and then about 300,000 in the first 10 months of 2021. So we know that groups like Anonymous have successfully launched cyber attacks against Russia recently. However, the spillover effect of both sides of these cyber attacks and cyber warfare is will likely spill over into other countries, which we found with a couple of attacks that targeted Ukraine, but the effect was then felt far and wide, so as far as the US, UK, and Australia as well. We also stated in the Ukraine conflict report that the field of cyber terrorism is relatively new for governments to navigate in terms of warfare. So with the invention of the internet, this ability to detect, avoid, and respond is quite difficult because it's a new landscape that we haven't navigated before. So response has actually already begun in Australia with yesterday's budget announcement pledged almost $9 billion for cybersecurity and intelligence. So we can see that threat is actually being taken quite seriously. Next, please. Next, please. So I'll get to right to the end there, please, the last slide. So that's all I have in terms of the Global Terrorism Index. But if you do want to get involved with IEP and the work that we do, we have the Ambassador Program, Positive Peace workshops, strategic partnerships are always welcome, and then the IEP Peace Academy as well. You can also see on screen that we have our socials, so feel free to follow us there. And yeah, I'm looking forward to the rest of the Q&A and the interesting questions that we have, I'm sure, coming through. Thank you, Julian.
No, thank you, Briahna. Again, an absolutely fantastic presentation and fascinating stuff. I've got lots of questions I'd like to ask you, but I'm going to start with a question that's come in to us, and it's actually from Stephen Blanks, who's a member of the Affinity's advisory board, but also the treasurer of the New South Wales Council of Civil Liberties. And I'm going to read Stephen's question out. I've certainly got my own opinions on it, which I might chime in after you, Briahna. But Stephen asks, should the official security response to terrorism be a contributor to fear? For instance, when ASIO says there is a rising threat in Australia which requires an increased level of security response, does that in itself cause fear? Is there a risk of disproportionate security agency responses to terrorism? And I'll just add on to that, do you ever consider this when you're producing your reports at IEP? And is there anything you do in your reports to lessen that threat halo from terrorism and effectively doing the job of the terrorists for them by alarming people who read the reports?
Well, I think personally it's quite important to produce things like the GTI to get that information out there and to get that data-driven response to it, rather than just stating, yes, terrorism is going up. We've said that deaths are going up, deaths are going down, but attacks are going up. So that is hopeful that, attacks are happening, but they are becoming less lethal. In terms of producing into that fear cycle, just from what I know as a criminologist, that definitely does happen, of course. But we also do need our agencies, I guess, in a way to respond to those threats. But yeah, I mean, what are your thoughts, Julian? Do you think, from your background, that it feeds into that fear cycle?
Absolutely. Yeah, 100%. And I think that the terrorists know it. And not only do they know it, that's the strategy upon which terrorism rests. We have the privilege at university in terrorism studies to be teaching about terrorism to students who often go on to work in these sorts of roles, and will often, in the first lecture, talk about, well, how does terrorism work? You have a person or a small group of people, and even the worst international terror organizations are still extraordinarily weak when we compare them to national defense forces. They can't stand up against a national army or defense. They don't pose a threat to national security. So how do they find a way to pose a threat to national security? Well, they leverage fear. And we know this from reading back to the anarchists in Russia 150 years ago, and that their attempts to leverage fear was the weapon, not the actual attack itself. And so I think that often we forget, when we do counter terrorism or talk about terrorism, why terrorism is successful, why it works. It's because it creates fear. And most of that fear is then designed to leverage some sort of disproportionate response or some sort of action that is against the better interests of that population who's being attacked. And so when we do counter terrorism, ASIO or whoever it might be, I would say that act of counterterrorism is actually part of the terrorist strategy, they're trying to provoke bad counterterrorism in our countries because that's how they win, not through direct attacks. So look, I couldn't agree more. And I think the more that strategy is discussed and we understand how it works, then the more we can, neuter terrorists and sort of puncture that threat halo and understand that, how we approach it and how we think about it and how we react to it is actually the key to responding to terrorism in an effective way. But look, that's my opinion. I don't want to dominate this discussion, Briahna. We're here to talk about your work, but I think that Stephen's really cut to the core of the issue there on why terrorism is an effective strategy and how best to deal with it. I'm not sure if you agree with me on that Briahna.
No, I mean, like I've been saying, I sound like a bit of a broken record, but terrorism thrives on insecurity, uncertainty, and again, fear. You're correct. It's that vicious cycle of, fear of terrorism and then terrorism becoming fearful. So, yeah.
Yeah, well, we could talk a lot about the role of the media in that cycle, the importance of the media. There's almost a symbiotic relationship between terrorists and media. As they say, if a tree falls in a forest and nobody hears it, does it fall? If a terrorist attack occurs and it's not reported in the media and nobody takes notice, is it a terror attack? Well, not really, because it's not really affecting an audience, is it?
Well, there's no terror, is there?
That's right. If there's no emotion of terror, then there might not be any terrorism. And I wonder, how much of that emotion of terror is created by our own institutions and social discussions about it. It's the key issue, really. But I was also really interested in your comments around the cyber domain. We at Macquarie University do a lot of work in cybersecurity and cyber warfare and so on. I'm sometimes asked to comment on cyber terrorism or to give a presentation or so on. What I find, Briahna, though, is the more I look into it, I can't find examples of cyber terrorism. I can find examples, of course, of the internet being used to radicalize people and terrorist propaganda being spread. They're very common. And cyber warfare is scary. If you think about the sorts of levers that states now have to attack one another through cyberspace, it's quite terrifying. But when I try to find examples of terrorists actually weaponizing the internet to cause harm directly rather than just through propaganda, I can't see them anywhere. And I'm quite suspicious now, I guess, or skeptical of the terrorists are going to be able to use the internet as a direct vector for their attacks. And I'm just wondering if you have any thoughts on that, or if you've seen anything that maybe contradicts that, in the data you're looking at.
I mean, in the presentation, I think I had a little bit of a dot point about how it's difficult in terms of the actual term of cyber terrorism to classify. You've got cyber attacks, cyber terrorism, cyber warfare. So I guess it's that language as well. But yeah, in terms of terrorists actually using the internet to impact groups of people, I mean, in a very loose way, you could use some of those denial of service attacks, anonymous attacking certain groups, depending on what you agree with anonymous or not. Are they terrorists? Are they not? Who's going to classify them as terrorists? It's really difficult to say. You've had attacks on financial institutions and all of that sort of thing through the cyber domain. But because it is difficult to ascribe them to a group, with the internet being the way it is, I guess, it does make it difficult to find a particular instance of a terrorist group like actually attacking someone. Yeah, I think you're correct there.
Yeah, it's making nuclear reactors explode or planes fall out of the sky or traffic lights run cars into one another and so on. It doesn't seem to be within the bounds of reality. It seems to be very much the realm of Hollywood.
Yes, but it remains to be seen what could happen in the future. Technology, evolves and changes all the time. So who knows? These things could be possible.
Sure. Yeah, and that actually brings up a good question. I mean, do you see in your reporting and your wider research and analysis in this space the role of new technologies? We talk a lot about how terrorists are usually early adapters and adopters of technologies. Again, there have been right the way back to the invention of dynamite and so on. And we see all these disruptive technologies such as 3D printing to be able to potentially print weapons. The use of drones potentially to carry weapons or to do harm or to use in surveillance. We have new horizons around artificial intelligence and maybe quantum computing down the track. are you seeing these effects in how terrorists operate, or, as we said before, are they really just falling back on the simple, on small arms and vehicles and so on to carry out their attacks?
In terms of the data that we have, it does make it difficult because we do rely on those old sorts of tactics. So your explosions, your armed assaults. So it really depends on the actual region we're talking about. Like we see in the US and North America in a wider space, that armed assaults and attacks using firearms are massively higher than anything else, really. But then we also see the reverse in other spaces where explosions are more. There are more explosions than armed attacks. So I feel like our report focuses on those. We do have an expert essay that actually does go into emerging technologies and the way drones particularly play into that space. So, drone attacks, we did see a lot of those especially in the Middle East in the last 10 years, I'd say. Terrorists and criminals find weird and wonderful ways of causing harm to people. So that could happen in the future with drones, especially, I'd say. If you want to go into sort of more technology in terms of like applications, we have seen the emergence of encrypted applications being front and center to especially far right or political terrors in general. So Telegram and all those sorts of things are playing a big role in the organization of terrorist attacks. So
Sure.
Again, depends on what you mean by a weapon, I guess. Do you mean to cause physical harm or as a means and driver of terrorism?
Well, that's right. The propaganda is the weapon sometimes, isn't it? If you think about propaganda of the deed, as we used to talk about, terrorists back in the 20th century, certainly. And that really segues into my last question tonight. You mentioned Telegram and the far right. Having just finished a project myself for the New South Wales government, with colleagues looking at the far right during COVID and their use of Telegram and encrypted, channels within Telegram. The question I think for a lot of people is, what will be the effect of COVID on terrorism more broadly? Not just the far right or the far left or one particular type of terrorism, but to sort of bring you out of your data-driven analysis and to ask you to speculate absolutely wildly, what would you say the long-term effects of COVID will be? Will there be any, or is this really just a blip and things will continue, as per 2019 or so soon?
Well, again, like I've said probably a million times in this presentation, unfortunately. So terrorism is definitely driven through insecurity. So we did see the COVID period was probably one of the biggest insecure periods for a lot of people, especially young people. And then with this added element of the internet and encrypted applications and the social media as well, it's really added an extra element to terrorism and to conflict that we haven't really seen before. So it's, again, really dependent on where we're talking about. Obviously, some regions were harder hit by COVID than others, but we did see a lot of violent demonstrations and demonstrations in general against COVID restrictions and vaccinations and things, especially in the West. So it really remains to be seen what that impact will have on terrorism. But yeah, you did have that online element of radicalization. So a lot of people on religious terrorists and also political terrorists that were being radicalized through these encrypted apps, especially, and falling into that cycle of your own perception of what's going on around you as well was definitely more apparent in COVID times when you couldn't go out and socialize with your friends or get outside opinions. But yeah, again, like I said as well, with Australia, the Australian government being concerned about the post-COVID rise in large gatherings and the return of music festivals and the like, that could attract more terrorism with more people being outside and concentrated in more groups. So there's all these different factors that come into play with COVID and what happens from here, I guess. We can't crystal ball too well, can we?
No, we don't want to crystal ball too much. One thing I think that we have seen though is with COVID, the conspiratorial frameworks that have come out of COVID and sort of anti-government conspiratorialism, potentially creating, the alignment of new groups, that wouldn't usually be anti-government. And I guess it remains to be seen whether those sorts of marriages of convenience and so on are going to continue into the future, and we're going to see new groups resorting to anti-government action, to follow these sort of conspiratorial theories or what have you. Certainly, it's very dynamic times when it comes to global security right now, with a lot of things on the horizon, including the conflict in the Ukraine. Now, I think, though, it is probably time for us to be wrapping up. I mean, we're getting now towards the hour. Really, I'd just like to thank you again, Briahna, for everything tonight. It's been a fantastic presentation, a great discussion. It's fantastic to hear more about, what the IEP is doing. But I'd also like to thank everyone at home who's been watching this and who's been sending in your questions and so on. It's an absolute pleasure to be able to have these discussions with you, Briahna, and talk about these really important issues that, for all we hear about terrorism in the media, often these sorts of discussions, are not necessarily front and center. So thank you so much.
Thank you for having me, and thank you, Affinity, for hosting.
Now, to end the night, I'd just like to call upon Affinity's valuable advisory board member, who we've already heard from tonight, Stephen Blanks, with your fantastic question you raised before. Stephen is the Treasurer of the New South Wales Council for Civil Liberties, as I said before, and he's going to present the concluding remarks of the program. So thank you very much, Stephen.
Oh, thank you very much, Julian, and good evening, everyone. Let me start by saying thank you to Patricia for the very warm welcome this evening, and Julian for your wonderful hosting of the conversation and guiding of the conversation. That was really fascinating. But Briahna, thank you for that presentation. It was a superb presentation. The work of the IEP is really impressive, and I'm so glad there is an organisation like yours that is producing this work. Let me say, and this is my civil libertarian take, that although you've given a whole lot of information about terrorism around the world, I find your report and the terrorism that's described in it much less scary than ASIO's response. And that was the point of my question, that the response of the national security agencies, at least in the West, can be disproportionate to the actual threat. And we are in danger, in Australia in particular, I think, for politically motivated responses to a threat which is where the response is disproportionate to the actual threat. But you're absolutely right in identifying terrorism as one of the greatest threats to peace, democracy, and humanity. And it is always to be condemned. So thank you very much for that. I want to say that Affinity's collaboration with the Institute for Economics and Peace tonight stands as a proof of thought, support, advocacy, and action of peace on a mission to spread in our communities, making Australia and the world a better place. Affinity and IEP are in a constant and continuous state of positive and proactive action, favouring a worldview that brings together shared humanity. And if I can just say a little bit about Affinity for those tonight who are not so familiar with it. Affinity is a multicultural platform of people who try to build bridges of peace and friendship and accept everybody in their respective positions and prepare a seat for everyone in our hearts. With this opportunity, I'd like to mention Affinity's home iftar dinners held during the holy month of Ramadan, which is about to start shortly. It all starts with an invitation. Come join a Muslim family at a house you don't know with people you've never met to enjoy a tradition you may never have heard of and leave with a heart full of love and a new understanding of your fellow human beings. Such is the home iftar tradition that Affinity and many other organisations around the world work to promote. It's a wonderful opportunity to meet with and build bridges, and I personally have participated in this experience. I brought my family to these dinners. It is a wonderful, delightful experience. So finally, if you haven't already done so, please make sure that you subscribe to Affinity's channel to keep up to date with our upcoming webinars. I hope sincerely one day we'll be able to meet F2F again, but in the meantime, we're all getting used to this online way of meeting. So thank you to our listeners and from home and our supporters. We look forward to hosting you at another Affinity webinar. Have a lovely evening.